Hello, hi, my name's Ren, and today I'm here to talk about the epic webcomic I spent years preparing and then gave up on. I'm going to introduce a lot of the characters, not all of them, there's simply too many, and the major plot points in the second part of the video, but first I want to give a bit of a backstory to the whole thing and explain why it'll never actually become a comic. If you just want to hear about my silly little OCs, you can skip all that rambling and go straight to part 2. So, first off, let's set the scene. I've spent a good chunk of the last year slowly going through my old art. This was in part to get some inspiration back after burnout, and in part a sort of autopsy to figure out what even made me want to give up on drawing as a whole in the first place. And one thing that is extremely prevalent throughout my sketchbooks and finished pieces is work related to one specific project. That webcomic I was planning titled Puppet Strings. There is basically not a single sketchbook I've filled since I came up with the first sparks of the concept that hasn't contained at least one drawing of one of the characters. It has been my companion since I conceptualized it at the ripe old age of 14. I remember at the time I was reading a lot of webcomics, and when I say that, I mean indie comics, the multi-person team, fully professional comics you see now on places like Webtoon weren't as prevalent back then. I really liked people's weird little passion projects. Some of those were rough around the edges, but I was not picky, and there are some that I still remember fondly and think about to this day, really. All this to say, I was very much into the idea of comics, and I desperately wanted to make one myself. One that was long and epic and would go on for years and years. I had it all mapped out in my mind, and then I never actually properly made it. But boy, did I work on puppet strings a lot. I have a whole A4-sized notebook full of world building, character pages, and even some concept art. I have hundreds of drawings of the characters. I probably thought about these little guys for hundreds, if not thousands, of hours. This was my big passion project for basically a decade of my life, and one that I've now decided to let go of. Now, this might sound sad, but to me it really isn't. It's more freeing than anything else, because after a lot of soul searching, I've realized I don't really want to work on it anymore. Sometimes a project like this, that used to be a treasure trove of inspiration and motivation, can become a metaphorical ball and chain. An emotional deadweight that reminds you that you still haven't done the thing and sapping all your motivation. And what used to be fun becomes an obligation. So how does that happen? What led me to change my mind on this thing that I used to love so much? And the answer to that is, it's a number of things. The main issue is that ultimately Puppet Strings is extremely of its own time, by which I mean it is so obviously, so painfully written by a teenager, and as such carries all the writing quirks and problems with it that you could expect from that description. It's not to say that it's awful or anything. There are good bones there. When I was coming up with the basic premise and plot as a teenager, I loved everything about it. I had taken all my favorite things from manga, webcomics, and books, threw them together to create the coolest, funnest thing I could come up with. This thing has it all. A main character with a mysterious past, a murder mystery, a high fantasy setting, a hot villain, dead mentors. This bad boy can fit it all, baby. There's suspense, comedy, and so much character drama. In my brain, it had all the potential in the world, but I am no longer 14. I haven't been in quite a while, actually. I have changed a lot in the last decade plus, and so has my taste. Now, most of the things I enjoyed reading back then, I would probably still enjoy, and if you showed me a comic like Puppet Strings, I would absolutely be down to read it. However, there is a world of difference between consuming a story and working on one. The themes and topics that are fun for me to write and rotate in my mind endlessly are much more limited than the ones I enjoy actually reading. And so, as I've changed over the years, I have slowly fallen out of love with puppet strings. And it has moved from a priority project to more of a sandbox to play in whenever I didn't know what else to do and I craved the comfort of something familiar. As a little side project, I would tinker around with it and add little bits of lore and characters to it now and again. And through that, it basically turned into a bit of an unsalvageable mess. I say this with utmost affection. The problem of working on little bits on and off again with only a vague plan for the plot and some vibes to guide the way means that many aspects of added lore or character bits clash or just kind of pull the story in entirely different directions. The whole thing was just barely held together by wishful thinking and teenage enthusiasm. The times I sat down to try and write a coherent plot outline that still contained all the parts I'd grown to love, I got overwhelmed and abandoned the endeavor in favor of the easier activity of just coming up with more fun bits of world building and backstory for the side characters. And theoretically, going back and wrangling it all into a coherent story is absolutely possible. In fact, now that I'm older and I have a much better grasp on writing and story structure, and I know more about how things work in general, and with a bit more emotional distance, it would be much easier to make the whole thing into a story that makes sense and that might even be good. And I have thought about it very seriously. There's something to be said about rebooting an old project into something new and inspiring that has all the best parts of what you used to love, plus all the new things you love now and the experience you've gained over time. Growing to love an old thing in a new way and giving it a second life is great, and I love seeing other people do it. But I'm not going to. Turning puppet strings into a functioning story would, frankly, require an insane amount of work and effort on my part. At its core, it's just a little too juvenile for my current taste, but much more damning is not the content, but the format. The actual genuine nail in the coffin for puppet strings is that to tell an epic fantasy story of this scope in the form of a comic would take years upon years of my life, probably a decade and more, and I simply refuse to do that. As a teenager, I didn't really understand what kind of undertaking it would be to spend a decade making one comic, so that never bothered me, because I wasn't thinking about that aspect at all. Back then, it was a fun idea, really, to have this fun thing around for so long and not have to come up with anything new. But now, I don't think I could do it even if you paid me to. Just to the idea that I could spend a decade more working on it to be almost 40 and to still be working on the same story I started when I was 14, the thought alone makes me shudder. I don't want this, no matter how good it has the potential to be. And it turns out I actually have a lot of ideas and consequently projects I want to work on. Not only would it bore me to stick to one single project for so long, I would also grieve all the things I could be working on instead and wouldn't have time for. I still love comics. I would still, as I said, read a comic like Puppet Strings with all its mixed inspiration of shonen manga, YA fantasy novels, and the things a teenager thinks is cool. But I can't be the one making it. There are a number of shorter and more contained comics I would like to make one day, which might reach hundreds of pages, but certainly not the thousands it would take for Puppet Strings. And we'll see if I even get to those. But for now, it is time to say goodbye to that old project. It brought me a lot of joy working on it for all these years, and because it felt wrong to just put it in a drawer, perhaps never to be seen again, I wanted to share at least a little bit of all the lore and characters that I've come up with over the years to give myself a proper feeling of closure. So, let me tell you about puppet strings. And while I do that, I will be working on sketches of the character as well as the finished illustration that's been going on in the background so far. A fair warning, I was still figuring out my workflow with Clip Studio, so some of these drawings are a bit on the messy side. It is what it is. But without further ado, let's get into it. And what better way to start than the main characters? This first one, Velia, is kind of the main character of a little group of main characters. They're all important and get prominent arcs, etc., but she's kind of the focus of the story. I had actually designed her as a standalone character before I decided on making a comic at all. Maybe that's the reason why her visual design is just so self-indulgent. It's got all my favorite colors, all my go-to comfort drawing shapes. I love her a lot. And of course, she also has a very intense backstory. To justify why she looks like that in a world where everyone else has regular hair and skin colors, I employed a classic writer's trick, justifying my design decisions as decisions of a character in the story. The thing about Velia is that she is not a real girl, as one might say. She's a living doll created by a very unwell man to aid with his grief over a woman who died tragically early and who he was obsessed with. Lucky for Velia, she never really has to deal much with this man, who is the kind of person who would make a lifelike doll version of a girl he was into, because he dies shortly after she's brought to life, so to speak, and a bit before the story itself starts. Which is also good for the tone of the story, because there's a lot of dark implications there that we can just quickly walk past because he's just not around anymore. Don't worry about it. Anyway, since she's not been alive for long in the story itself, she isn't very well informed on how the world works, which is another classic writer's trick to make exposition a more natural part of character interactions. Her main motivation going into the story was to find the people responsible for killing her creator or father and bring them to justice, and also to make sure no one uses his work to harm other people. Because it turns out, whoever killed the man who made her also stole a lot of his notes on how to build and animate something like her. And not just that, they also used that information to build some pretty dangerous automatons themselves. They don't seem to be alive in the same way Velia is, and so far it seems like whoever is building them hasn't quite figured out how to make them function correctly, because the ones that have been found have just been kind of wandering around, and unfortunately in some cases they've also attacked people and buildings. While Velia is human-shaped, the other automatons we see in the story are mostly multi-legged and also huge. They're mechanical but animalistic in look and behavior, ranging from four-legged to centipede-inspired. In short, they are mechanical monsters that allow the story to have cool fight scenes that can mostly be enjoyed without feeling bad over watching your good guys kill something alive, because they're a fantasy version of weird robots, so it's fine. And there can even be fun, colored, blood-like fluids. What more could one want? It's also important to me that Velia, while she is a sweetheart, has also killed people. For what she thought were good reasons, but you know how it is with young people. They don't really have a good grasp of morality and are kind of easy to manipulate. And spoiler for some late story reveals, but this is what happens to her. Getting manipulated is a pretty big part of her story, because it turns out that the man who has been helping her, in quotation marks, with finding and stopping her father's killers is, in fact, the guy who did it. His name is Christian Sinclair, is the main villain of the story. I will get back to him in more detail later, in his own section. But important for Velia is that after she finds her creator's corpse, he's there to tell her his version of events, that supposedly some shady group of people killed her father, which then means he can point at people who are in the way of his personal agenda and get her to kill them by convincing her that they are involved in that plot and are about to use her father's research for their own purposes. So, despite having good intentions, she's got some skeletons in her closet, which will hopefully lead to some juicy character drama with the rest of the main characters once they find out what she's done. Now, because she's a mechanical miracle, she has some advantages over regular humans. She's insanely strong and much more durable. She's also heavier than a person her size should be, and both these facts combined were going to be a source for some comedy bits. And while she doesn't need traditional food or drink, she does need to refuel her energy, which is done in this case by drinking a fun-colored liquid. More on that later. One thing about her that is also very important to me personally is that she is Arrow Ace. I myself am too, and it was very meaningful to me at the time to write a character who shared that with me, at a time where I was just starting to figure myself out and getting the right vocabulary for it. In general, the cast of Puppet Strings is very queer overall, and many of them were the first characters I intentionally set out to write as queer, and therefore they will always have a special little place in my heart. But that's enough of her. Let's move on to our next character, Matthew, my sunshine boy. He was conceived as the secondary protagonist for the story, and even though he actually got a pretty major redesign somewhere along the way, he's been overall consistent from the beginning. He's a very conventional protagonist, confident, optimistic, and kind. And perhaps not surprisingly, that was something I struggled to write back then because he simply wasn't the kind of character I gravitated towards as an edgy, depressed teenager. Matthew was kind of bland for a while until I had the idea to give him more depth by adding a savior complex to his brain. It's definitely not ideal for his mental or physical health because it means he disregards his own comfort and safety in order to help other people. You just know that he's headed for a pretty big crash at some point in the story because he is burning the wick at both ends. And this whole thing opened up fun new options for conflict with the other characters as well. No one likes seeing their loved ones repeatedly throw themselves into grave danger without a good plan, because of course, being very impulsive is another important facet to his personality. He's big on act first to think later, which gets him in trouble regularly, but also means that sometimes, he manages some truly impressive stuff no one expected to work or thought to do in the first place, because it was kind of an insane thing to do. Ultimately, to me, he is very rescue dog-coded, big, friendly, and full of enthusiasm, and always there to dig someone out of a bad situation. But perhaps not the greatest intellectual out there. And while I was trying to give him more dimension than just classic protagonist personality, I also ended up developing his family a bit more. I'm not going to get super deep into it here because those people do very little for the actual story. He's the oldest child of two. He has a little sister, Rose. And for a bit, he had a second younger sibling, but that one died tragically young of medical issues. It has left everyone in that house with some issues, suffice to say, as you might imagine. His little sister ended up training to become a healer, in part because of what had happened, and she was supposed to appear somewhere in the story and teach the other characters some basic healing magic that they were then meant to use during the big cool battle at the end of the story. Because you just know, with the way I introduced Matthew, that he was going to get grievously injured while doing some dumb but brave stuff during the climax of the story. And of course, because ultimately this was not meant to be a tragedy, he has to survive his insane heroics somehow. And also I love him, so I couldn't let him die. Next in our group of main characters is Killian. I'm not even going to pretend that I don't pick favorites among my characters. he comes in easily in second place behind Valia because I love this guy. And most of that is because I gave him some depressive tendencies and a dramatically sad childhood. Also, the fact that he's a gay disaster bookworm who's bad at interacting with people outside predefined social scripts helps. He's the grumpy cat to Matthew's golden retriever. He's got that resting bitch face, even though he's mostly just awkward but well-meaning. And while Matthew is very quick to trust and make friends, Killian is a bit more cautious on that side, which is also why when Velia first shows up and joins the group, he's very suspicious of her. Which is pretty fair. She is kind of a weirdo. After the first time they fight together, though, he has to admit that while there's certainly something up with her, she doesn't seem to be a bad guy, and they bond over time. As you can imagine, he especially does not react well when the gang finds out Valia has killed a bunch of people in the past. I haven't mentioned him before, but Matthew, Killian, and Eileen, who I'll get to next, are all students at this universe's cool fighting school, which happens to be a military academy. They're training to become the kind of person who gets called in to bring down one of those aggressive giant automatons and other threats of that caliber. I bring this up now because it's relevant to Killian's backstory. Because the job they're training for is also what his father used to do. His mother, too, actually. That is how the two met, and they studied together, then worked together in the same unit for a while. And then, eventually, Killian's father got killed on the job, which happened when Killian was around 6 or 7. His mom ended up leaving that work out of the reasonable concern that it might kill her too, and she didn't want her son to bury another one of his parents. And as you could imagine, she's really, really unhappy about Killian trying to follow in his father's footsteps. They had a really big fight about it and are barely on speaking terms at the time where the story happens. It also didn't help that she got remarried at some point. Her second husband is a really nice guy, and he's tried to bond with Killian, but unfortunately, that has never really worked. That kid was not willing to accept a new father figure into his life. Anyway, this is also why Killian, unlike some of the other students, lives in the dorms instead of at home. There are events during the story which lead him to have to move back home, which also eventually facilitates him working through his issues with his parents. That's for later. He's got a lot of emotional growing to do during the story because he likes to repress any emotions stronger than mild enjoyment, which is not great for him, but very entertaining for me. Besides all that, he's actually really good at his schoolwork and training, a real teacher's favorite, which might also have to do with the fact that a lot of the mentors and teachers there knew/know his parents, and as such, have also met him when he was just a little guy, a little toddler. There's so much more lore on him as well, but this video is already way too long to discuss all of that, so we will be moving on. Now for our last character in the main group, Eileen. She's a bit harder to talk about than the other ones, mostly because past me really did her dirty. Not in the sense that I did anything bad to her character or with her arc, but more in the sense that I really didn't give her much attention in general. I had very clear ideas on what I planned to do with the other characters. They had pretty solid basics and a clear arc ahead of them, but with Eileen, I was never really quite sure what to do, so I just kind of glanced past that issue, which meant I mostly just added superficial details here and there, like fleshing out her family or her favorite animal, it's birds, or giving her romantic history, but never really touched on the core problem with her writing, which is that I didn't really know what her personality was supposed to be like. I wanted her to be more chill and responsible than the boys, someone who was used to mediating because of her family situation, who mostly just kept her opinions in and helped other people with their problems. And you can see how that's not very compelling by itself, right? I had, without thought, reproduced the way many important girl Characters in shonen get sidelined and denied interiority in favor of more attention on the other, typically male characters. And that kind of sucks. I wrote her badly, and then I didn't spend a lot of time thinking about her in any depth because I already didn't find her compelling. What a shitty move on my part. But now that I'm older and wiser, and even though I'm not here to do a detailed rewrite of the whole thing, I think I can at least take the time to make Eileen a bit better of a character. So, who is she? Well, from the outset, she looks very composed and mature. I'm keeping that, but that's really more of a facade she puts on because she's learned to put other people's comfort first. Her parents are divorced and had a pretty tumultuous relationship leading up to that, which meant that Eileen was forced into a bit of a mediator role while also working to shield her younger sister from as much of all that was going on. This also means that she had very little chance to spend her time on things she wants or enjoys, which naturally breeds at least a bit of resentment towards people who had those opportunities. Her default reaction is to bottle up any and all negative feelings towards other people, especially the ones that she knows are not warranted, and to never, ever look at them again. This, as we all know, doesn't actually help with anything, and instead just means a number of her relationships are strained under the weight of all this unacknowledged negativity. It leads her to sometimes blow up on people or just give them a cold shoulder for what, to the other person, looks like no good reason at all. And this is not helped by the fact that, unlike Killian and Matthew, all the skills they're training in don't come naturally to her. It feels like she has to work twice or thrice as hard as these other people, and she's still struggling. This was always meant to be a part of her character, but I don't think I realized back when I added this aspect that things like this can run deep, and in fact are more compelling if they fundamentally influence someone's worldview. I think it's very fun to explore a character who is so wrapped up in all the ways that they themselves have suffered that they miss all the ways in which they are actually quite lucky. Turns out, dysfunctional characters are way more fun than those without problems, and I think that in the past I was so busy trying to make Eileen unobjectionable and nice that I made her bland, which I feel like can happen very easily with main characters, and maybe even especially women, because female characters tend to get the short end of the stick in fandoms no matter what they're like. So yeah, to make her interactions with the other characters more interesting, I think it'd be fun if she'd be very rule-oriented, while Matthew is a lot more on the chaotic good end of the spectrum. I also think it opens up very interesting ways for her and Valia to play off each other, where Valia can question a lot of Eileen's assumption and internalized rules by making her try to verbalize them, and then realizing how irrational a chunk of them really are. And of course, someone who puts other people's opinions and perceptions on such a pedestal has to have some way to release all that resulting tension. And I love a good breakdown, be it public or private. They're very fun. I also think it makes a great contrast to have her be someone who puts other people first, because she has been taught, directly or indirectly, that it's the right thing to do, but resents it as a limitation on her own choices, versus someone like Matthew who puts other people first because they genuinely believe that other people's needs matter more than their own. Ultimately, Eileen is someone who wants to be good and who wants to help others, but who struggles with it because she also wants to be selfish, since it often feels to her as if no one considers what she wants at all. Which is not objectively true, but we all know feelings don't care about that. And that's our quartet of main characters. I won't be going over all the side characters in this much detail. Instead, we'll take a detour into world building and the plot and go into characters when they come up. Now that I've given you some info on the protagonist, let's do that world building thing. I hate naming things, so neither the world, nor the country, nor the city. Most of the story takes place and actually has names. However, the city is the capital of that country, so that at least is something, if not a proper name. As I mentioned, this story takes place in a high fantasy world. We have magic, we have unusual animals, including dragons, because I love dragons, and we even have some not exactly explained magical tech stuff. So, let's talk about that magic. I'm a big fan of not having one super specific magic system, but to have different places interact with magic differently based on their own traditions and discoveries. Our protagonists understand magic as a sort of energy that exists in the world around them and pools and collects in different places, but typically in nature. There are, in fact, plants and animals that actively attract it and also condense it into substances that can be harvested or collected and then used by humans to either extract that magical energy, store it, or just create fun potions and items with it. The magical energy can also be channeled through the use of specific runes and patterns. For those rituals, magic could theoretically be pulled right out of the air, but for anything besides tiny workings, the ambient magical energy is not enough, especially in cities where there isn't much of it to go around in the first place. So, for most magical workings, people typically use magic that is either bound in a liquid or a solid, like specific types of crystal. This is also, incidentally, how Velia and the automatons are powered. Actually, Velia has a number of those crystals that can store magic embedded in her own body, and she has to drink magic-infused liquids in order to function. Think of the crystals as something like batteries. They're there to disperse magic across her body effectively and also store it. She can still function if just one or two of them get damaged beyond repair, but if it's too many, then she's fucked. What happens if she runs out of magic juice? Nothing good, certainly. At first, she gets slower and her senses get duller, and if she is all out of magic, she will stop working entirely. Will that kill her? Well, we'll get back to that later. Another thing about magic I want to mention is that if enough of it collects in the same place, it starts forming temporary bodies and developing maybe not a life of its own, but certainly something that looks a lot like emotions and instinctive reactions. In one forest that's known to be highly saturated with magic, you can even spy those spirits taking the shapes of animals or something similar for a time, but typically they don't stay like that for long. They're very ephemeral, and it takes absurd amounts of magic to create something with enough of a sense of self to make itself look like anything specific for an extended period of time. As I mentioned, magic is also used for tech in the sense that the technology that they do have, lights and trains for the most part, are powered via magic. What we don't have is magic guns, because I didn't want to draw any. So everything is still very blade-centric, also mostly because I think swords are cool. So that's how that is. Generally, magic is too expensive to just be used in random gadgets, so while it does affect a good number of things, the world is still fairly grounded. I took a lot of historical inspiration, but also just went off vibes for a good chunk of the world building. That's also pretty obvious in the fashion. I originally wanted it to have a lot of elements of Victorian era styles, but the longer I worked on it, the more it became just a vague inspiration. While I ran off into the "this looks cool to me" territory and didn't look back at my references all too often. So yeah, these are the vibes we're working with. Let's now, slowly and carefully, approach the precariously balanced house of cards that is the plot. Our protagonists first interact when the trio of students is sent out on a mission together with their mentor to take down one of those automatons that's wreaking havoc. They also mention how this is the first one they've actually managed to see in action. Typically, They take a while to arrive on the scene, and then the things are already down and some of the more important pieces missing. But since we've got some characters mentioned, let's talk about them for a second. Our mentors. The first mentor and the one who's gotten by far the most development out of all of these characters, the mentor characters that is Olivia. She's patient and capable, and while the other mentors mostly didn't choose the role, she really enjoys being a teacher and made an effort to get this job specifically. She's also a family friend, Killian's parents, so they're especially close, though she tries very hard not to give him special treatment compared to the other kids. I say kids, they're all between 19 and 21, so not that young. Anyway, Olivia is the more emotionally intelligent and available mentor and tries to keep the kids on track and safe without being too overbearing. She's just all around a good guy. The other mentor is Jackson. I will freely admit he never got much of a personality beyond gruff and demanding, but with a soft spot for his charges that he developed mostly against his own will. I think most telling about how little I've considered him throughout the years is that he doesn't have a settled design at all. He just didn't matter to me, and I feel a bit bad about it, but alas, that's how it goes in a big cast of characters sometimes. Now, back to the plot. When they arrive on the scene of the rampaging automaton, they barely get to do anything before the thing is already crashing in on itself. In fact, their presence worked to distract the hooded figure who was fighting it, which is obviously Velia, so she actually gets injured during the fight. She pays enough attention to our little guys to be able to recognize them later on, even though they don't have a good enough view to see much of her. They just notice that guy's pretty small. And as our investigators are left puzzling over a problem they no longer need to solve, we actually follow Velia back to her base, which is located in an isolated country estate owned by none other than Christian Sinclair, who graciously offered it as a refuge for Velia's creator, and then later her, after the guy tragically died. And since this was always meant as an introductory scene to this group of characters who will eventually be revealed as the bad guys TM, let's immediately break from the plot again to discuss yet more characters. Now, there's a lot I could be saying about Christian in particular because I simply love him a lot. Classic move on my part. I love men who suck. Let me be clear, he is the main villain of the story. Fortunately for you, I'm not going to go into all the details of his life that I have spent hours and hours thinking about in ridiculous detail. Instead, I will give you some broad strokes and leave it at that. Otherwise, we would be here forever. So, what's up with this guy? To boil his scheme down to the simplest parts, he's trying to become king. If you asked him, he'd claim it's so he can fix all the things going wrong in the country, and to a certain degree, he really believes that. It's also, conveniently, a plan that will benefit himself quite a lot in the process. He's been working on that whole thing since he's been a teenager himself. He's in his 30s now. There are a lot of moving parts and a lot of connections he already has, some because he's good at networking and some simply because as the third son of an influential noble family, he just kind of gets them handed to him. Anyway, he was already deep in schemes when he heard about Velia's creator working on building functioning automatons through the grapevine. He eventually contacted him, and while he has no use for a lifelike humanoid automaton, he was interested in the possible application of something like that. So he offered that man financial support and a new workshop outside the city in that self-same country estate I already mentioned. Velia's creator was always mentally unwell and paranoid, and didn't trust Christian, and, he was right about that. He was definitely not interested in letting somebody else profit off his personal work, and he correctly identified that that was what Christian was after. So, when he got close to finishing his living doll, he started destroying his notes and research as much as possible, which did not go unnoticed and is ultimately why he got killed earlier than otherwise. Not before Velia got woken up for the first time and had some interaction with him as well as Christian. Those two were, at that point, the only two people she had ever seen. Anyway, her creator gets killed by Christian. She finds his corpse. Christian gives her a story about how the people wanting to steal her father's work killed him and are trying to use it for their own gain, and how he's totally not one of them and definitely on her side. Obviously, he doesn't actually care about Velia. He doesn't even see her as a person, per se. To him, she's the only working prototype he can work off of to build his little dream automaton army. He has to keep her around and willing to let his engineer look her over and try to piece together how she actually functions and then imitate that. This is all something Velia only finds out near the end of the story, of course. As we get to know him first, he's understanding and seems kind, but there's also an undertone to it. The way he interacts with her was supposed to strike a reader as weird, as it's more akin to talking to a pet that you're humoring instead of a full person. Velia, of course, doesn't find it strange until she starts interacting with a lot more people who do treat her as a person. That is when she starts picking up on that weird undertone, and it is also when their relationship gets worse. And obviously, there is pretty major fallout between them in the end, obviously. To me, Christian is just a fun little guy. I love mastermind characters. I, as I said, love horrible men in fiction, manipulate, mansplain, man-whore. We know how it goes. He's all three. My guy. Beside him, there were two other notable characters in our little villain team. The first is our resident, somewhat unhinged scientist, Lily, short for Lillian. She's the main mind behind working out the automaton problems for Christian. As such, she's also the one who always checks Velia over after she comes back from one of her little missions. Actually, I don't think I've mentioned that before, but obviously the rampaging automatons are malfunctioning. They are not doing random destruction on purpose. And to keep their development as low-key as possible, Velia is sent out to stop the ones that manage to run off before they can do too much damage. And some other people are sent to retrieve as many parts as possible after she's done taking them down. This also has the upside of making Velia feel as if she's doing something and as if her doing the things Christian tells her to do, including getting rid of people who are politically inconvenient to him, are the morally correct thing. Anyway, we're talking about Lily. She is really fun. She doesn't respect Christian all that much. Yeah, she works for him, but she's just here because it's an opportunity to do interesting work and perhaps even some unethical work she otherwise wouldn't be able to do. His grand ambitions mean nothing to her. As such, their dynamic is her mostly doing what she wants, which often happens to coincide with his interests, but often enough it doesn't. It's just a fun back and forth to me because I think it's important that a guy who thinks so highly of himself has someone tell him he's full of shit at least somewhat regularly. This is not to say this woman is a good guy. I support women's wrongs. Her interactions with Velia are also often on the verge of creepy and they're boundary pushing because just like Christian, she doesn't really see her as a person. To her, she's a curiosity to be studied. And ideally taken apart so that she can better understand how this curiosity functions. Now, beside her, we have Christian's personal assistant and confidant. His name is Evan, and he's not doing much in the story by himself, to be quite honest. He's a serious guy and there to facilitate Christian's plans. He's also there to be more obviously cold and dismissive of Velia, especially when he's there to give her new missions when Christian is otherwise occupied. Evan is not just a personal assistant, however, he is also a bodyguard because, and this is relevant, he used to work in the same unit that our protagonists are training to join. There are indeed still some connections he has there. We will get back to that later, but suffice to say, Evan is competent and ruthless and very on board with Christian's plans and ideas. He has no qualms about murder. And with that, let's get back to the story for a bit again. We follow Velia as she interacts with our villains, gets the injuries, the damage from the battle fixed up, and when she admits that other people have seen her, she is then told by Christian to lay low for a bit and that he won't be sending her out on errands again anytime soon. Ostensibly for her own safety, but mostly because he doesn't want anyone looking too deeply into what she is and then draw conclusions. So Velia doesn't like being told to do nothing for a while. To her, it feels like a betrayal. It feels like she's being excluded from this important work just because she got a bit injured. So, in order not to look like she's useless or a liability, she wants to investigate by herself. Which is why she goes and seeks out these other people she saw on her last mission. And that is exactly how they meet again. I had written out several different ways that first meeting could have gone, and looking back, none of them really work well as building blocks of a story, so suffice to say, they meet. Velia is a bit awkward and suspiciously forward about wanting to work together, and while the others are a bit suspicious, Killian in particular, they eventually agree to hear her out and see if they can get anything done together. That's important to note that Velia doesn't share all her backstory, just half of it. She doesn't give any information on the people she works with, but focuses on the conspiracy that she believes exists around her dead creator and the automatons. She really tells them enough to make them see value in working with her. This is also one of the first serious snags in the story where I knew I wanted these people to hang out together and investigate a bit together to build some trust, but I didn't know how to make it work. So just imagine that happens. Since we are in the capital and our trio of kids would partially be busy with classes and practice, let's take another detour to introduce some of our characters. Let's start with our other teen group. First one we'll talk about is Elizabeth. She's the one in the middle, one of those characters with a resting bitch face who is actually fairly chill in conversation. Unlike Anthony, the one on the right, she has a very strong work ethic and convictions, which regularly leads to some friction between both of them, since he's a lot more laid back and lackadaisical. It's usually Corbin, the one on the left, who's left with the task of peacekeeper between them. That's most of what I can tell you about him, because he was a later addition to the cast, and since I wasn't immediately compelled by him, I just didn't think about him much. I did play around with the idea of him being one of those people who work really hard because they feel like they have to make up for their own shortcomings, and bonding with the other two because they are more capable than him and were also willing to do some additional training just to help him out. Anyway, Elizabeth, like Killian, but not for the same reasons, is actually there against her family's wishes. Her family is pretty influential and wealthy, so she was meant to tie down some business benefits via marriage for her family's advantage, but she refused because she felt like this was a more important thing to do, but also because she couldn't stand letting other people make decisions for her. She's also an eldest daughter, so that informs a bit of her relationships towards all the other characters. I am, again, not gonna lie, Anthony was both the first one of the trio to ever get fleshed out at all, and also the first one to get a visual design. I drew this guy so much because he is so fun to me. I love him. But it is not all visuals. I gave this little guy a character bit I really enjoy. He's the kind of guy who seems very chill and like nothing in the world could ever bother him, but it is all just a front. He's simply been too deeply disappointed when he genuinely tried hard, so now it feels safer to not try at all. He's not quite the youngest sibling in his own family, but he does have a number of older ones who have been given responsibilities and roles in the family business, while he's been passed over and left to just kind of do whatever. For some time, he thought that becoming a really cool fighter would get his parents' respect, but that didn't really pan out either, So now it's much easier to live up to the expectation of being the black sheep of the family. Another tasty aspect to it is that he is genuinely talented. He could easily excel and outperform his peers if he tried, but alas, he refuses to, which also has earned him antagonism from his teachers and mentors, who are either disappointed that he's wasting himself or just plain annoyed by the fact that he seems to be wasting their time. These three will feature a bit at other points in the story, and if I had ever fleshed out the plot more seriously, I'm sure they each would have gotten their own little arc and a lot more character depth than they currently have. The first big plot point after some bonding, investigating, and getting familiar with the setting is a big fancy ball, because I think it's fun to dress up your characters in fancy outfits. Something that was meant to be present in the background for several scenes in the capital and mentioned in passing is that there is a crown jubilee coming up, which includes a number of big parties and balls, and also a bunch of visitors from other countries. Because they're special little trainees in the military academy, all the students are expected to attend one of the more important parties, and because they're now friends, they snuck Velia in with them. She mentioned to them that she'd never been to any party before, and this was a once-in-a-lifetime chance, and why shouldn't she get to have a bit of fun after her life so far had been such a downer? And since this is the really nice ball, which important people and nobles also attend, guess who's also there? Christian. And he is not happy to see her palling around with those military brats. He takes her aside subtly, and once they're alone, tries to, once again, manipulate her into doing what he wants, which is, in this case, not being there. However, since she has had some character growth, Velia refuses to do that and insists that she is going to get some information by herself, she'll be useful, and since this is not a place where he can afford to get caught with this fucking freak, he begrudgingly has to let her walk away. But another fun thing about this ball is that I get to introduce yet another character who I love, but who is not quite as important to the story as a lot of others. Let me introduce you to Jules. Jules is a thief and a conman and an all-around charmer. They are also very dear to me because they were the first explicitly non-binary character I ever wrote. Since then, a lot of other ones have come along, but the first will always be special. As I mentioned, they're a professional liar and have crafted a completely fake rich person persona, which does get them invited to high society events all the time. They have those bullshitting and networking skills, and if some people find jewelry or other valuables missing, well, no one suspects them. Even though Puppet Strings is very anime-inspired, no one has natural crazy hair colors in it. Jules' red hair is absolutely dyed. Their natural hair color is a dead brown, but you won't catch their roots growing out because Jules is very meticulous about their appearance. Another thing about them is that they're a love interest for Eileen. I felt like their personalities would play off each other really well, with Jules being very open and playful and Eileen being more reserved, but very willing to go along with some harmless shenanigans now and again. On that note, I'd also played around with the thought of making the two of them childhood friends, but I never actually settled on that decision. It would be an easy out for them to have a strong relationship and an explanation why they're so close at all, since they have such different lives. I also played with the thought of Jules having a pair of trained magpies that they raised themselves that help them with their illegal acquisition of shiny things. But that was another very early draft thought. It would be very cute. It would be very cute. And who doesn't like some mischievous little critters? The ball was also a great opportunity to introduce another character who I will actually not go into detail about here because she was kind of stupid. Not the character, but the concept of the character. You know, a lot of anime have that one crazy killer/stalker character. Yeah, she was like that, combined with a suitably melodramatic and ridiculous backstory, and the less said about or thought about her, the better. Probably one of the most cringe teenage writing aspects in the whole story, frankly. Anyway, there was supposed to be a suspicious death at the event and a stolen object of nebulous importance that would remain a mystery for a while. Obviously, it was the villain's doing, and in the grand scheme of things, it was going to further Christian's political agenda. I can't give you more details because I also do not know them. I never figured that one out. After this ball, there is another little hole in the story where I was not sure what to fill the time with, only that I had to, and it would probably involve some more cute bonding and light investigation. Perhaps even outside of the city in a forest so that we could see some more magical critters and see some ruins and do some more world building, But the next meaningful thing that happens was planned from the very beginning. This is the part where the stakes are raised and the status quo really changes. Throughout the investigation and work that our protagonists have done, they have collected some automaton parts as well as other evidence, which is currently kept safe somewhere in the military academy vaults. Unfortunately, that means that our villain is going to expend more energy to get it back, which leads to a whole wing of the academy being set on fire as a distraction, and then a break-in happening. At that time, Olivia is the only one still in the building, and while she does see the perpetrator, she isn't on guard because it is in fact someone she knows. Unfortunately, this also means, because she's a very credible witness and more than capable of putting two and two together, that she can't be allowed to walk away from that. So, tragically, our beloved mentor is killed, literally with a knife in her back. And that has some fun, dramatic consequences for the cast. First and foremost, of course, the emotional devastation for our little ducklings who had imprinted on her as a parental figure. It hits Killian especially hard because it brings up everything that's happened with his dad, but the other two don't really do well with the news either. It is actually a catalyst for a bit of a falling out between all of them. There's fighting, some yelling, more than a few words said in anger that they don't really mean, but that hit really hard nonetheless, the way they only do when coming from someone who knows you well. It also provided me with a chance to think of funerary rites and rituals and the opportunity to give some of that information to the audience as well, without lore dumping too much. For similar reasons, I had planned for a wedding to be in the later part of the story, for a short bit of emotional positivity once the plot was getting more tense and serious. It was for Eileen's mom remarrying, by the way, and would have also given some more insight into her family, as well as shown off some character development. Alas, I absolutely have no time to go into detail on any of this because I am aware of how long this video already is. Apart from the emotional fallout, which quickly leads to a reconciliation where the cast now understands each other a bit better and comes out of it with a stronger friendship, you know the drill, it also marks the part of the story where all the teens are removed from the investigation into the automatons and given leave to grieve in peace with their families. This is naturally the last thing our protagonists are interested in doing, and so begins the part where they work on their own to uncover what happened both to their mentor and in regards to Valia's maker. But since they now spend some more time at home, it allows them to work through some conflicts with their families, especially Killian gets to sort out things with his mom. Finally. There were also, throughout, and especially in the second part, some romantic subplots planned, but I am also not going to go into them because they're not that important. Now that they've lost access to the official investigation, they need some outside help. For one, they get some more support from Jules, who is very good at getting access to things the not-so-legal way, and also they have connections. These kids are also going to use their relationships to other people at the academy to get some classified intel, which brings us to our last bit of character introductions, actually. Let's start with the teenager of this group. On the right of the page, this is Frederica. She's studying in the labs research division of the academy and was one of the people who also worked on the automaton parts that were recovered by the military. As such, she also had access to most things that have been documented and theorized on this end. She's a sweetheart who isn't great with people, but she loves to talk about her interests and all the cool stuff she's working on if given the chance. She doesn't really socialize much, so she's very enthusiastic when she gets a chance to share. She's a bit of the eccentric scientist type, but less in the crazy and more in the bad with people, but trying their best and still managing to be really awkward kind of way. She was supposed to already get introduced much earlier on in the story, but I was trying to pace these character bits a bit, so she's only getting mentioned now that she's actually contributing to the plot. And her contribution is important. It's info from the lab that was collected from the fire that was intentionally set. So now our characters know there's some subterfuge afoot. The other character that gets a bit more important in this section is Dahlia, the one in the middle. She's one of the teachers the gang has for some of their classes. She is strict and has high expectations, which is also why Killian is her favorite for being both smart enough to do well, motivated enough to actually do the work plus some extra, and also well-behaved enough to not offend her sensibilities. Which then gives him the chance to wheedle some important information out of her that ends up helping them put some puzzle pieces together. Also, and this is really funny because I'll be saying something similar again almost immediately. She's the sister of one of our villains. She and Lily are close in age, but she's the older one. They have a bit of a rocky relationship now, not because of the slightly unethical science Lily is involved in, but because her lack of decorum and sense of propriety offends Dahlia on a fundamental level. The fact that they look similar is something Velia notices when she meets Dahlia for the first time and allows for some speculation if maybe she's a bad guy in disguise, a fun little red herring for the audience. At least in theory, you know. And yes, her hair is also dyed. She and Lily do have the same taste in colors, and they have been using these same dyes for most of their lives, and they match on purpose. It's kind of cute to me. I like to imagine that Dahlia started it, and Lily refused not to match with her cool older sister. Now, as I mentioned, the real comedy bit is that the next character is also the sibling of one of the villains. Let's talk about Nora. She is one of those less developed other mentor characters I mentioned at the start of all this, and in fact, I don't know much about her except that she's the mole who stabbed Olivia in the back. Like her brother Evan, she believes in what Christian is trying to achieve and is unconcerned with having to leave some dead bodies in her wake on the way to that goal. She does feel a bit bad about Olivia, mostly because it felt unnecessary, and she did like her. They were co-workers on good terms for years, but alas, sometimes you just gotta do what you gotta do. As you can imagine, this also lends itself to a fun, dramatic reveal with the teens, and especially our supporting cast teens later on, who all thought they could trust her and now have to reckon with the fact that they spent years looking up to a murderer. You can tell she's evil from the art because I gave her a knife. I'm lying, of course. She mostly just had the knife because I was running out of ideas of what I should do with these characters' hands while they're all standing around. But yes. Now, on their own, the kids slowly uncover a bunch of clues while investigating and occasionally fighting some automatons and other people because there has to be some action throughout the story. And just like that, a picture starts to emerge. And of course, unlike the other characters, Velia has some more information that she hasn't shared yet, and as such, can figure out what has been going on before any of the others get there. This, of course, is tinged with guilt for her because a part of the information that lets her put together that she has been misled and that actually Christian has been lying to her for a long time now is finding out some background information on the people she herself killed and how they fit into the emerging scheme they're uncovering. She isn't good enough at hiding her emotions, so the others ask what is up, and though she didn't mean to tell them, she is bad enough at lying that they catch on to some of the implications of what she's saying and not saying. So she ultimately admits to what she's done, which, once again, as I said, leads to some juicy character drama and a fight, which makes the group split up because, understandably, the other three are shocked and horrified at finding out that she's kind of a murderer several times over. She leaves, and while she is gone, they come to the conclusion that they don't think she was lying to them about her intentions, and that even though she has done some bad shit, her heart is in the right place. How much can they really blame her if she has been manipulated her entire life, which has been very short? They have fought side by side with her. They know really that she's trustworthy, even, if she didn't tell them everything. Alas, while they are discussing and dealing with those revelations, she is off to confront Christian about her own revelation directly, which obviously not a great idea, but she has a lot of confidence in her abilities and also kind of doesn't think about how wrong this could go on every level. When she does confront him in their usual meeting place, he's not happy, and first he tries the classic, guilt-tripping her about how she's been working with untrustworthy people behind his back, even though he told her she shouldn't. But she has had some development and now is more than willing to argue and stand her ground. She doesn't fall for his manipulations. They just make her angry enough to throw her own accusations right at his head. And realizing that she isn't going to be swayed, he drops the mask of kindness he wears and reveals the full level of disdain he's been feeling for her, and tells her, among other things, that she's pathetic and naive and that she really ought to thank him for A, killing her maker because she would not have enjoyed actually living with that fucking freak, and B, for letting her keep deluding herself with the idea that she's a real person and not just another machine. And then he just straight up tries to kill her. Fortunately, she is stronger and faster than both him and his assistant, so she makes it out alive, if not entirely unharmed, and also emotionally very shaken. And because she doesn't know where else to go, obviously, she goes back to the only other friends she's ever had. And we have now made it to the climax of the story. Our villains jump right into the final stages of their plan, which does involve killing the current king and his family, and whatever people might find themselves in between that goal and Christian's automatons, which, by the way, they've gotten to work more reliably after an epiphany from Lily. Christian knows that Velia will try to warn people about his plan, so they are out of time, and it has to happen now if it ever will. Velia and the other three make up, they recruit the other group of teens, as well as their other acquaintances that we've met over the course of the story. There's a big, very cool climactic battle with riveting, emotionally loaded fights. Just believe me, it would have been so cool, for sure. I'm not just saying this. It's true in my heart, I know it. During the fight, Matthew was meant to get lethally injured, as I alluded to earlier, so they managed to save him via the healing magic that they learned from his sister, also earlier in the story, and that spell they're using is powered with one of Velia's crystals. He survives, no worries, but because now her body doesn't work quite right anymore, she ends up being a bit too slow and imprecise in the final battle, and gets so damaged that she stops functioning. And she just has a few last emotional moments to exchange with our other heroes, and then the light behind her eyes goes out. But worry not, as I said, this is a dramatic but not ultimately tragic story, so in the last few chapters we see them repair her mechanical body with the help of Frederica and Lily. Actually, she really had no particular emotional stake in the whole thing that Christian was doing. She just enjoys fun science projects, and her sister got her to come and help out with this one, given that she is the expert on this. Now, even with the body repaired and charged with some magic, it doesn't immediately bring Velia back at first. And that's where we get Lily to explain the crux of the problem with the automatons and what it was that made Velia an actual person. I'm sure you totally remember me earlier dropping lore about how sufficiently concentrated magic starts becoming incorporeal spirits which have some emotions and consciousness, but which are short-lived without a body. Yeah, she is one of those. Through being bound into a consistent corporeal form, she has developed into a consistent person with thoughts and feelings who wouldn't just reconstitute into something else at the drop of a hat. A lot of her maker's notes were concerned with this sort of binding, and that is also why, while building the automatons, Lily also just did that. It seemed to work, right? And she didn't know that this would give them something like a personality and emotions of their own, which in turn made them pretty bad at following orders. Once they left that part out, they worked perfectly along their programming. But yes, Velia's soul, let's just call it that for simplicity, is not currently inside her body. It resides, in fact, in the large crystal she used to always wear as a necklace, which Matthew picked up and kept with him at all times when it looked like she was maybe dead and her body lay there destroyed. So it's quite easy to then get it back into her new body from that necklace, and at which point she opens her eyes and everything is fine. And that's it. That is our happy ending. Our crew decides to go explore the world together instead of staying in the military. Nice. Which mostly was planned because I wanted Velia to have the chance to see the world, but also I thought it would give myself the opportunity to explore the world more in little snippets of story told after the end. Which absolutely is not happening now, but that was my intention back when I wrote it the first time. So this is it. Puppet strings and all its important characters and plot points. It feels great to have gotten this out into the world, even if it wasn't in its intended form. Now I can finally let it rest in peace. If you managed to stay through the entire thing, thank you. I really appreciate you listening to this, and if you have any thoughts about the story, I would love to hear them. While I won't work on it anymore, these characters are important to me still, and I love to yap about them, so in case you have any questions, feel free to ask in the comments. I will reply, for sure. I'm going to go now because this video has gotten very much longer than intended. I hope you guys have a great rest of your day, and I will see you around.